The bell above the shop door rang, and Rosalind Hartley looked up with the practiced smile she gave every customer who stepped in from the rain. The smile froze before it reached her eyes. Standing in the doorway, water dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor, was a man she had spent 3 years trying to forget. Alaric Thorne, Duke of Ashworth, did not move. He simply stared at her, as if the shelves of ribbon and thread and the small brass bell had all conspired to play a cruel trick on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain hammered against the window behind him, and somewhere in the back room, a kettle began to whistle. Rosalind found her voice first. "We are closing soon," she said, though it was barely past noon. "You will want to find shelter elsewhere." Rosalind. Her name left his mouth like something he had been carrying for a long time and could finally set down. He stepped further into the shop, ignoring the wet trail his boots left behind him. "It is you." She busied her hands with a bolt of blue cloth, refusing to look at him again. "I do not know who you think I am, sir, but you have mistaken me for someone else." "I have not." His voice was low, but there was an edge to it now, something between disbelief and anger. "I would know you anywhere. I searched for you for months. Do you understand what you did? You vanished. No letter, no word to anyone. Your room was empty, and your trunk was gone, and no one in the house could tell me where you had gone or why." Rosalind's hands stilled on the fabric. Behind the counter, a narrow door led to the back room, and she glanced toward it as though she might simply walk through it and disappear again, the way she had disappeared once before. But there was nowhere to go this time. The shop was small, and he stood between her and the only door to the street. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "Whatever you think you owe me, whatever guilt you carry, I release you from it. Please, go back to London." "Guilt?" He laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Rosalind, I have not slept a full night in 3 years without wondering if you were safe, if you were well, if you were even alive. I do not want to be released from anything. I want to know why." The back door opened, and a stout woman with gray hair pinned beneath a linen cap stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. This was Mrs. Winifred Cole, the shop's owner, and the only person in Devonshire who knew even a fragment of Rosalind's past. She took one look at the tall stranger dripping rainwater onto her clean floor, then at Rosalind's pale face, and understood at once that something was wrong. "Can I help you find something, sir?" Mrs. Cole asked, stepping between them with the ease of a woman who had broken up disputes before. "I am not here to purchase anything," Alaric said, though his eyes never left Rosalind. "I am here for her." Mrs. Cole's eyebrows rose. She glanced at Rosalind, who gave the faintest shake of her head, a silent plea. "My assistant has work to finish before the day is done," Mrs. Cole said firmly. "If you have business with her, you may return another time, when the shop is not open." For a long moment it seemed Alaric would argue. His jaw tightened, and his hands, still gloved from the ride, curled slightly at his sides. But something in Rosalind's expression, some quiet desperation she could not quite hide, made him relent. He gave a short, stiff bow. "Very well," he said, "I will return." He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, and looked back at her one final time. "You cannot hide from me twice, Rosalind. I have already lost you once. I do not intend to lose you again." The bell rang a second time as he stepped back out into the rain, and the door swung shut behind him. Rosalind let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and her legs, suddenly unsteady, found the edge of the counter for support. Mrs. Cole watched the empty street through the window for a moment before turning to her. "Who was that man?" "No one," Rosalind whispered. "No one I know." "Rosalind." Mrs. Cole's voice was gentle but firm, the tone of a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband, and had long since learned when someone was lying to protect themselves rather than deceive. "That man looked at you as though you were the only person left standing in a burning house. Do not tell me he is no one." Rosalind pressed her fingers against her temples, willing the sudden ache there to subside. 3 years. 3 years of building a small, quiet life in this town, of learning the names of the fishermen's wives and the baker's children, of falling asleep without the weight of fear pressing on her chest. 3 years of believing that the past could not follow her here, to a shop at the edge of a coastal town where no one asked questions about who she had been before. And now he had found her. "He is the Duke of Ashworth," she said finally, the words feeling strange after so long unspoken. "I once served as a companion in his household, to his cousin, the Viscountess. I left without telling anyone. I did not say goodbye to a single person, not even him." Mrs. Cole's expression softened, though curiosity still lingered in her eyes. "Why did you leave that way?" Rosalind shook her head. "It is not a story I can tell, not even to you. Please, Do not ask me again." "I will not press you," Mrs. Cole said, though her tone made it clear this was a promise given reluctantly. "But you should know, my girl, that a man does not travel through rain like this and stand dripping in a shop full of ribbons unless he means to come back. Whatever you left behind, it seems it has not forgotten you." That night, Rosalind climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the shop where she had lived since arriving in Devonshire. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and let herself remember, for the first time in a long while, the life she had fled. She remembered the grand house in London, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors she had never known and never would. She remembered the Viscountess, kind in her own careless way, who had hired her as a companion after Rosalind's own family fell into ruin. And she remembered Alaric, who was not supposed to notice a companion any more than he noticed the furniture, and yet somehow always did. Small kindnesses at first, a book left on a table she liked to sit near, a question about her opinion during a dinner where no one else thought to ask her anything at all. She had told herself it meant nothing. A duke did not fall for a companion with no fortune and no name worth mentioning, but somewhere between the quiet conversations in the library and the evenings when he lingered longer than necessary in rooms where she happened to be, she had begun to hope. And hope, she had learned since, was a dangerous thing for a woman in her position. The threat had come quietly, the way most dangerous things do. A letter, unsigned, slipped beneath her door one evening. It spoke of her father's old debts she had believed settled long ago, and made clear that unless she disappeared from the household within the week, the scandal attached to her family's name would be dragged into the light, and with it, the reputation of everyone she had grown to love in that house, including the man she could not admit she loved most of all. She had not questioned the threat. She had simply packed what little she owned, written no letters, said no farewells, and left before dawn on a coach bound for anywhere but London. She told herself it was an act of protection, not abandonment. She told herself that Alaric would forget her in time, that a duke had 100 paths open to him that did not include a penniless companion with a shadowed past. She had been wrong about one thing at least. He had not forgotten. Rosalind blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the rain slow to a gentle patter against the roof. Somewhere in the town, perhaps at the inn near the harbor, Alaric Thorne was doing the same, staring at a different ceiling, turning over the same unanswered questions. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed not of the threat that had driven her away, but of the library in London, and a book left open on a table, and a voice asking her, gently, what she thought of the ending. In the morning she woke to the sound of the shop bell ringing, before she had even opened the front door. Mrs. Cole was already downstairs. When Rosalind came down, still tying her apron, she found a folded note waiting on the counter, sealed with a mark she recognized instantly. She did not need to open it to know what it said. He had promised he would return, and the Duke of Ashworth, whatever else had changed about him in 3 years, was not a man who broke his promises. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal, and read the single line written in his familiar hand. "I will be at the Harbor Inn until you agree to see me. I am not leaving Devonshire, Rosalind. Not this time." Rosalind read the words 3 times before she could make herself set the note down. The paper was fine, the kind she had once handled every day in the household but had not touched in 3 years, and its weight in her hand felt like a piece of her old life pressed suddenly into her palm. Mrs. Cole watched her from across the counter, saying nothing at first, only sliding a cup of tea toward her the way she might toward a customer who had taken ill. "You look as though you have seen a ghost twice in 2 days, she said. "Perhaps I have," Rosalind answered. Outside, the town was waking. A cart rattled past over the cobbled street, and a fisherman called a greeting to another across the way, his voice carrying easily through the thin morning air. Rosalind had come to love these small, ordinary sounds. They belonged to a life she had built with her own hands, without title or fortune, a life where no one looked at her and saw only her father's ruined name. She had guarded that life carefully, the way one guards a candle flame in the wind, and now a single note threatened to blow it out entirely. She thought of the Harbor Inn, its narrow windows facing the sea, and pictured Alaric standing at one of them, waiting. She thought of the years she had spent convincing herself that he had likely married by now, that some other woman occupied the rooms of his house and the corners of his thoughts, and that her leaving had, in the end, cost him nothing at all. The note in her hand told a different story, one she was not certain she had the courage to face. "You do not have to see him," Mrs. Cole said gently, misreading the silence. "Whatever trouble follows that man, you have a home here. No one will make you go back to it." "That is kind of you," Rosalind said. but I do not think it is so simple anymore." She folded the note again and slid it into the pocket of her apron, where it sat like a small, sharp stone against her hip for the rest of the morning. Customers came and went, and she smiled and measured cloth and counted coins with hands that did not quite feel like her own. All the while, a single thought turned over and over in her mind, refusing to be set aside. He had crossed 3 counties in the rain to find her. He had stood in a shop full of strangers and declared, without shame, that he would not leave without her. Whatever waited for her at the Harbor Inn, it was no longer a question of whether the past had found her. It had. The only question left was what she intended to do about it. And for the first time since the morning she had fled London before dawn, Rosalind found that she did not already know the answer. Rosalind did not go to the Harbor Inn that day. She told herself it was because the shop needed her, that Mrs. Cole could not manage the afternoon rush of customers alone, that there were orders to fill and accounts to settle. All of it was true. None of it was the real reason, and she knew it even as she repeated the excuses to herself. The real reason stood at the edge of the harbor each morning that week, in plain view of anyone who cared to look. Alaric did not return to the shop again, not after Mrs. Cole had sent him away that first day, but he did not leave Devonshire either. He walked the length of the harbor each morning and each evening, his coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the fishing boats come and go as though the rhythm of the tide might somehow explain the woman who had vanished from his life without a word. The town noticed him quickly. A stranger of his bearing, tall and finely dressed even in his plainest coat, could not walk the same stretch of harbor for 3 days running, without becoming the subject of every conversation held over shop counters and kitchen tables. By the end of the week, half of Devonshire seemed to know that a nobleman had come looking for someone, though few could say exactly who. "They say he asks after you at the inn," Mrs. Cole said one evening, as she counted the day's earnings into a small wooden box. "Not by name, mind. He simply asks if anyone has heard of a woman who arrived here 3 years past, quiet, keeps to herself, works in a shop near the church." Rosalind's hands stilled over the bolt of cloth she had been folding. "You should not have told him where to look." "I told him nothing," Mrs. Cole said firmly. "But this is a small town, Rosalind, and you have lived here 3 years without ever once telling anyone the truth of where you came from. People notice a silence like that, even if they are too polite to ask about it outright. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the pieces, whether I spoke a word or not." That night, unable to sleep, Rosalind found herself standing at the window of her small room above the shop, looking out over the rooftops toward the harbor, where a single lamp still burned in the window of the inn. She thought of the years before her flight from London, when her days had been measured not by the ringing of a shop bell but by the quiet rhythms of the Viscountess's household. She had been a companion there, expected to read aloud in the evenings, to fetch shawls and mend torn hems, to occupy the strange, invisible space reserved for women who were neither family nor servant. It should have been a lonely position. In truth, it often was, except for the evenings she found herself in the library, where Alaric kept a collection of books that no one else in the household seemed to touch. She had gone there first simply to escape the noise of the drawing room, and she had expected, the first time he found her curled in a chair by the fire with one of his books open on her lap, to be reprimanded for the liberty. Instead, he had asked her opinion of the ending. It became, without either of them planning it, a habit. She would read, and he would join her, and they would speak of the books as equals, in a way she was permitted to speak with almost no one else in that grand house. He never once made her feel the difference in their stations, not in those quiet hours among the shelves. And it was there, somewhere between one chapter and the next, that she had first understood the danger of what she was beginning to feel. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window now, 3 years and many miles removed from that library, and let herself remember the last evening she had spent there before everything changed. He had given her a small volume of poetry, nothing extravagant, simply a book he thought she might enjoy, and as he placed it in her hands, his fingers had lingered against hers a moment longer than was proper. Neither of them had spoken of it. Neither of them had needed to. 2 days later, the letter had arrived beneath her door. She turned from the window and lit her candle, retrieving from the bottom of her small trunk a folded piece of paper she had carried with her every mile of her flight from London, though she had never allowed herself to read it since arriving in Devonshire. The paper had softened with age and handling, its edges worn smooth. She unfolded it now for the first time in 3 years, and read again the words that had ended her life in that house. The letter named her father's debts she had believed settled by the modest inheritance left to her after his death. It spoke of certain gentlemen in London who had not forgotten those debts and who would, unless she removed herself quietly from the Duke's household within the week, See to it that her father's disgrace and her own presumed part in concealing it became known throughout society, ruining not only her own prospects but casting a shadow over the household that had taken her in. There had been no signature. There had never needed to be one. She had understood, reading it the first time, exactly what was being asked of her, and exactly what would happen if she refused. A companion with no fortune and no family to defend her had little power to fight such threats, and even less power to protect the man she loved from the scandal that would follow her wherever she remained. So she had left. She had packed only what she could carry, taken what little money she had saved, and boarded the first coach leaving London before the household had even woken. She had told herself, through every mile of that journey, that it was an act of love rather than cowardice, that Alaric would be safer and freer without her, that in time he would understand, if he ever thought of her at all, that she had done what she believed was right. She folded the letter and returned it to the trunk, her hand steadier than she expected. Whatever answers Alaric had crossed 3 counties to demand, she was not certain she was ready to give them. To explain the letter was to admit how deeply she had once cared for him, and to admit that was to open a wound she had spent 3 years carefully sealing shut. The following morning she was measuring ribbon for a customer when the shop bell rang and Lord Edmund Vane stepped inside, shaking rain from his hat with the easy good humor of a man who had never once in his life been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. He was a frequent customer, one of the few gentlemen of standing in the area, and in recent months he had made no secret of his growing interest in the shopkeeper's quiet assistant. "Miss Hartley," he said warmly, removing his gloves, "I hoped I might find you free this afternoon. There is a concert at the Assembly Rooms, and I thought you might do me the honor of attending as my guest." Rosalind managed to smile, though her thoughts were still tangled in the letter she had reread the night before. "That is very kind, Lord Vane, but I am afraid I have obligations at the shop this week." "Surely Mrs. Cole could spare you for one evening," he pressed, his tone light but persistent. "I have asked you 3 times now, Miss Hartley, and 3 times you have found some obligation to prevent it. A man might begin to wonder if the fault lies with his company rather than your schedule." Before she could answer, the shop bell rang again, and both of them turned to see Alaric standing in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes moving from Rosalind to Lord Vane and back again, with an expression that had gone suddenly, dangerously still. "Forgive the interruption," Alaric said, though his tone suggested no genuine apology at all. "I did not realize Miss Hartley was engaged in conversation." Lord Vane, sensing an unfamiliar tension in the room, glanced between them with open curiosity. "Do you two know one another?" "We are acquainted," Alaric said, before Rosalind could find her own words. "From London." Something in the way he said it, quiet and deliberate, made Lord Vane's easy smile falter slightly. He looked at Rosalind, as though searching her face for an explanation she was not prepared to give, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, none of the 3 of them spoke at all, the rain against the window the only sound in the small, crowded shop. Lord Vane recovered first, straightening his coat with a small, deliberate motion, as though restoring his own composure by restoring his appearance. "Well," he said, his voice carefully light again, "London is a large place to be merely acquainted with someone. You must forgive my curiosity, Your Grace." The title landed in the shop like a stone dropped into still water. Rosalind saw the exact moment Lord Vane placed it, the flicker of recognition crossing his face as he matched the tall stranger's bearing to a name he had likely heard spoken of only in passing, at dinners and clubs far from this quiet corner of Devonshire. A duke, standing dripping in a shopkeeper's doorway, asking after her by name. "Your Grace," Lord Vane repeated, slower this time, testing the words. "Forgive me. I had not realized we entertained such distinguished company in this part of the county." "I am not here as company," Alaric said. "I am here on a private matter. With Miss Hartley." It was not quite a question. "Yes." Rosalind felt the color rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something closer to fear, she could not have said. She set down the ribbon she had been measuring, her fingers trembling slightly, and forced her voice to remain steady. "Lord Vane, I am sorry for the confusion. His Grace and I knew one another in London some years ago, when I was employed as a companion. There is nothing more to it than that." It was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the whole truth, and she suspected, from the tightening at the corner of Alaric's mouth, that he had noticed the omission as clearly as she had intended it. Lord Vane studied her for a long moment, and something in his easy, confident manner seemed to dim, replaced by a wariness she had not seen from him before. "I see," he said finally. "Well, I will not keep you from your private matter, Your Grace." He turned back to Rosalind, and his voice softened, though there was a new formality to it now. Miss Hartley, I hope you will still consider my invitation. The offer stands, whenever you are free of your obligations." He gave a short bow, first to Rosalind and then, more stiffly, to Alaric, before gathering his hat and departing into the rain. The bell rang once behind him, and then the shop was quiet again, save for the steady patter of water against the window and the faint crackle of the fire in the back room. "A suitor," Alaric said, once the door had fully closed. It was not quite a question either. "He is a customer," Rosalind said carefully. "As are many gentlemen in this town. Few customers invite a shopkeeper's assistant to a concert 3 times over. You have been here only a matter of days, Your Grace. I did not realize you had already begun keeping count of my invitations." The words came out sharper than she intended, and for a moment something almost like the old warmth flickered across his face. The ghost of the man who used to sit beside her in the library, trading quiet observations over the pages of a shared book. Then it was gone, replaced by the same guarded intensity he had carried since walking through her door 3 days before. "I have kept count of a great many things since you left," he said quietly. "It has become something of a habit, in the absence of anything better to occupy my thoughts." Mrs. Cole emerged from the back room at that moment, drawn no doubt by the sound of the bell and the long silence that had followed it. She took one look at the pair of them, standing on opposite sides of the counter, as though a great distance rather than a few feet of polished wood separated them, and cleared her throat pointedly. "The shop closes within the hour," she said. "If you have business to discuss, Your Grace, I suggest you discuss it plainly, or return when there are fewer ribbons between you." Alaric's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Rosalind felt something in her chest tighten painfully. He had always possessed that particular gift, the ability to find humor in even the most difficult moments, and she had forgotten, or perhaps simply refused to remember, how much she had loved that about him. "Very well," he said, turning back to Rosalind. "I will not press you tonight. But I ask one thing, and I ask it plainly, as your employer suggests. Walk with me tomorrow, along the harbor, in full view of anyone who cares to watch. I am not asking you to explain yourself in a room full of ribbon and thread, Rosalind. I am asking for an hour of honesty, nothing more." She wanted to refuse. The word was already forming on her lips, the same word she had used to send him away that first afternoon. But something in the quiet steadiness of his request, the absence of any demand or accusation, made the refusal falter before she could speak it. "1 hour," she said finally, "at noon, when the tide is out." 1 hour, he agreed, and for the first time since he had stepped through her door dripping with rain, something like relief passed briefly across his face. He gave a short bow, gentler than the one he had offered Lord Vane, and left without another word, the bell above the door ringing softly behind him. Mrs. Cole waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded before she spoke. "A duke," she said slowly, shaking her head. "All this time, and you never once mentioned you were acquainted with a duke." "It was not a thing I wished to remember," Rosalind said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were no longer entirely true. Standing in the fading light of the shop, with the scent of rain still lingering in the air where he had stood, she found that the memory of him, far from being something she wished to forget, had never truly left her at all. That night, she did not reach for the letter hidden in her trunk. Instead, she lay awake thinking of the harbor, and the tide, and the hour she had promised him, wondering what honesty, after 3 years of careful silence, might actually sound like when she finally allowed herself to speak it. The tide was out by the time Rosalind reached the harbor, leaving long stretches of wet sand exposed beneath the gray morning sky. Fishing boats sat tilted on their sides, waiting for the water to return, and gulls picked at the shallow pools left behind in the rocks. Alaric was already there, standing near the old stone wall that separated the harbor path from the beach, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she remembered from countless mornings in London, when he would stand exactly so before a window, lost in thought. He turned as she approached, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind carried the smell of salt and drying seaweed, and somewhere behind them, a fisherman's dog barked at the gulls circling overhead. "You came," he said finally. "I said I would." They walked in silence for a while, following the curve of the harbor wall, keeping a careful distance between them that felt, to Rosalind, both entirely necessary and strangely painful. She had spent 3 years training herself not to think of him, and now, walking beside him with the wind pulling at her shawl, she found that every careful wall she had built seemed to be made of nothing more substantial than sand. "I have thought of 100 ways to begin this conversation," Alaric said at last, "and none of them feel adequate." "Then perhaps you should simply ask what you came to ask." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and there was something raw in his expression now, something that had not been there in the shop, where anger and shock had masked whatever lay beneath. Why did you leave, Rosalind? Not the version you might have prepared to tell me. The truth. I have earned that much, I think, after 3 years. She looked out at the water, at the boats resting on their sides, and tried to find the words she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind but never once spoken aloud. It was not a decision made lightly, she said. I want you to understand that, whatever else you believe of me now. Then help me understand it. The wind pulled a strand of hair loose from beneath her bonnet, and she tucked it back with fingers that trembled slightly. There were debts, she said. My father's debts, from before his death. I believed them settled, but I was wrong. A letter arrived beneath my door one evening, informing me that certain men in London intended to make those debts, and the scandal surrounding them, public knowledge, unless I removed myself from your household within the week. Alaric's expression darkened. Why would anyone care about the debts of a companion's father? What threat could that possibly pose to men of standing? Because it was never truly about the debts, Rosalind said quietly. It was about you. About what my continued presence in your household might come to mean, if certain feelings between us were ever allowed to develop openly. There were those who would have seen any attachment between a duke and a penniless companion as an opportunity, Alaric. An opportunity to extract money, to threaten exposure, to use my father's disgrace as a lever against your family's name. I was not important enough to matter on my own, but as someone you might have come to care for, I became valuable in a very different way. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point far out over the water. You should have come to me, he said finally. You should have told me, and let me decide what risks I was willing to take. And what would you have done? Her voice rose slightly, carried on a note of old frustration she had not expected to still feel so sharply. Paid them off? Confronted them? Alaric. Men like that do not simply disappear because a duke tells them to. They would have found another way, another weakness, another door left unguarded. I could not risk that the door they found next led back to you, or to your sister, or to anyone else I cared for in that house. Leaving was the only way I knew to close every door at once. So you decided, alone, in the space of a single night, that the right course was to vanish without a word. His voice had gone quiet again, but the quiet was worse than the anger, heavier, filled with a hurt he had clearly carried a long time. Do you know what that did to me, Rosalind? I searched every corner of London. I hired men to make inquiries in every county within 100 miles. My sister thought I had lost my mind. And all the while, you were somewhere, alive, choosing silence over the truth. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself from having to trust me with the choice. The words came out sharper than perhaps he intended, and he seemed to catch himself, drawing a slow breath before continuing. I do not say that to wound you. I say it because it is what I have come to believe, turning this over for 3 years. You decided I was not strong enough, or not important enough, or not trusted enough, to be given the chance to stand beside you against whatever threat came. You made the decision for both of us. Rosalind felt the sting of his words settle somewhere deep in her chest, not because they were cruel, but because some small, honest part of her recognized the truth in them. She had told herself, through every mile of her flight from London, that she was acting out of love, out of selflessness. But had she also, in some quiet corner of her heart, feared what it might mean to hand him the choice and watch him hesitate, to learn, in the moment that mattered most, that his affection did not run as deep as her own? Perhaps you are right, she said softly. Perhaps I was afraid of more than the debts. He looked at her then, something shifting in his expression, the anger giving way to a kind of cautious, searching hope. Afraid of what? Afraid that if I gave you the choice, she said, forcing the words out though they cost her something to speak, you would have chosen carefully, sensibly. That you would have found a way to protect your family's name and quietly ensure I was settled somewhere far away, with enough money to live comfortably and never trouble your household again. I did not think I could bear watching you make that choice, Alaric. It seemed kinder, to both of us, if I simply removed the choice altogether. The wind picked up, pulling at the hem of her dress, and for a long moment Alaric said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge entirely. You believed I would have chosen my family's reputation over you. I believed you would have chosen the sensible course, as any duke would be expected to. Then you never truly knew me at all, he said, and there was something almost like grief in the words. Or perhaps I never gave you reason enough to believe otherwise. I do not know which is the harder truth to accept. They had reached the far end of the harbor wall, where the stones gave way to a narrow path leading up toward the cliffs, and Rosalind found herself stopping there, unwilling to walk further, as though some invisible boundary marked the limit of how much honesty she could bear in a single morning. "What do you want from me now?" she asked. "You have your answer. You know why I left. What is it you hope to gain by coming here?" Alaric turned to face her fully, and the look in his eyes was one she remembered from the library in London, from evenings that had felt, at the time, like the safest hours of her life. "I did not come for an explanation, Rosalind. I came because I could not continue living without knowing whether there was anything left to save. I do not care about the debts, or the men who threatened you, or what any of London's gossips might say if the truth of your family ever came to light. I care that you are alive, and that you are standing in front of me, and that some part of me has never stopped hoping I might find you exactly this way. Alaric, I am not asking you to return to London with me today," he said quickly, before she could form whatever protest was rising in her throat. "I am not asking you to marry me, or to forgive 3 years of silence in the space of a single walk along the harbor. I am asking only that you allow me to stay, to prove, however long it takes, that you were wrong to believe I would have chosen sensibly over you." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment, the wind carrying the smell of salt between them, and found that she had no answer ready, not the practiced deflections she had used in the shop, nor the careful walls she had spent 3 years constructing. There was only the truth, unguarded and frightening in its simplicity. Some part of her had never stopped hoping for exactly this moment either. "I need time," she said finally. "You cannot undo 3 years in a single conversation, however honest." "Then I will give you time," he said. "As much as you require. I only ask that you not send me away again without a word, whatever you decide." She nodded slowly, and together they turned back toward the harbor, walking in a silence that felt, for the first time since his arrival, less like a wall between them and more like a fragile, uncertain peace. Neither of them noticed, as they made their way back along the stone path, the figure of Lord Edmund Vane standing near the top of the cliff path, watching them with an expression that had darkened considerably since the previous evening in the shop. Lord Vane did not approach. He remained at a distance, half hidden by a cluster of wind-bent trees, and watched as the Duke of Ashworth walked beside Rosalind Hartley with the careful, deliberate closeness of a man who had waited a long time for such an hour. He had come to the cliff path that morning for no particular reason beyond a restless walk to clear his thoughts, and instead he had found the very thing he least wished to see confirmed. He had known, from the moment the Duke stepped into the shop and spoke that single, damning word "acquainted," that his own prospects with Rosalind had grown suddenly complicated. But watching the pair of them now, their heads bent toward one another in quiet conversation, their steps matched without either seeming to notice, he understood the complication ran far deeper than he had first believed. This was not a chance acquaintance renewed. This was a man who had crossed the length of England for a woman he had clearly never stopped loving, and a woman who, whatever her protests to the contrary, had not once looked away from him during the whole of their walk. Lord Vane turned from the cliff path and made his way back toward the town, his thoughts turning over the problem with the same careful calculation he applied to any difficulty in his life. He was not a man accustomed to losing what he wanted, and he did not intend to relinquish his pursuit of Rosalind simply because a duke had appeared to complicate matters. If anything, the discovery only sharpened his resolve. A woman who had once captured the attention of a duke, and who now stood quietly resisting his return, was clearly a woman of uncommon character, precisely the sort of wife a man in his position ought to secure before someone else did. He resolved, walking back toward the harbor inn where he intended to take his midday meal, that he would press his own suit more urgently in the days ahead, before the Duke's presence in Devonshire could harden into something neither Rosalind nor circumstance could easily undo. Meanwhile, Rosalind and Alaric had reached the edge of the harbor path, where the cobbled street began and the shop fronts of the town came into view. She slowed her steps, aware that whatever privacy the empty stretch of sand had afforded them was ending, and that the eyes of the town would soon be upon them both. "I should return," she said. "Mrs. Cole will wonder where I have gone." Of course, Alaric did not move to detain her, though something in his expression suggested he would have gladly walked the length of the coastline twice over, if it meant prolonging the conversation a while longer. "Might I call on you again tomorrow? Not at the shop if that causes difficulty, wherever you think it wisest." Rosalind considered the question, turning it over with more care than its simplicity perhaps warranted. 3 years of guarding her own solitude had made her cautious of any arrangement that might draw further attention, and yet some part of her, the part that had spent the entire walk fighting the urge to reach for his hand as they passed along the harbor wall, did not wish to say no. "There is a small church at the edge of town," she said finally. Beyond the baker's shop, along the lane that climbs toward the hill. I sometimes walk there in the evenings, after the shop closes, when the light is good and the town is quiet. You may find me there tomorrow, if you wish, though I make no promise of what conversation you will find. That is more than I hoped for this morning, Alaric said, and the faint smile that crossed his face, brief as it was, reminded her sharply of evenings long past, of a library, and a fire, and a book left open between them. Until tomorrow, then. He bowed, more formally than the moment perhaps required, as though conscious suddenly of how many eyes in the small town might already be watching them, and turned back toward the Harbor Inn. Rosalind watched him go for a moment before she, too, turned toward the shop, her thoughts a tangled mixture of relief and unease that she could not quite untangle no matter how she tried. When she reached the shop, Mrs. Cole was waiting behind the counter, arranging a display of thread with unusual concentration, though Rosalind suspected the older woman had been watching the street through the window for some time before her arrival. "Well," Mrs. Cole said without looking up, "you have color in your cheeks that was not there this morning." "It is only the wind," Rosalind said, though she could feel the warmth in her face and knew the excuse was thin. Mrs. Cole set down the spool of thread and studied her properly now, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Whatever passed between you two on that harbor wall, it was not a simple conversation. I have known you 3 years, Rosalind, and I have never once seen you walk back into this shop looking quite so unsettled." Rosalind untied her bonnet and hung it on its usual hook, buying herself a moment before she answered. "He asked why I left," she said finally. "I told him. And he did not react as I expected." She busied her hands with straightening a shelf of ribbon that did not truly need straightening, if only to have somewhere to look besides Mrs. Cole's knowing expression. "I believed, all this time, that if he ever learned the truth, he would understand why I had no choice but to leave without a word. Instead, he seemed almost wounded that I had not trusted him enough to let him choose for himself." Mrs. Cole considered this for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, the manner of a woman who had lived long enough to know that matters of the heart rarely resolve themselves as neatly as one hoped. And was he wrong to feel that way? Rosalind did not answer immediately. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften, and the sound of the sea carried faintly through the open shop door, mingling with the murmur of the town going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place within these 4 walls. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "I have spent 3 years so certain that leaving was the only choice, the only way to protect him. I never once considered that in protecting him, I might also have wounded him in a way that could not be so easily mended." "Then perhaps," Mrs. Cole said gently, returning to her thread, "it is worth considering now, before the man leaves Devonshire, and you spend another 3 years wondering what might have happened if you had." Rosalind said nothing to that, though the words settled somewhere deep and stayed with her through the remainder of the day, through the closing of the shop and the quiet supper she shared with Mrs. Cole, and long into the evening, when she sat once more at her window, watching the lamp still burning faintly at the Harbor Inn, and wondered, for the first time without immediately silencing the thought, what tomorrow's meeting at the church might bring. Alaric did not sleep well that night. He sat by the narrow window of his room at the Harbor Inn, watching the last lamps of the town flicker out one by one, and turned Rosalind's words over in his mind until they had worn a groove there, familiar and aching. She had believed he would have chosen sensibly. She had believed, after everything, that his affection for her would have bent beneath the weight of scandal and reputation, that he would have quietly arranged her removal to some distant corner of England rather than risk his family's name. The thought stung more than he cared to admit, not because it was cruel, but because he could not entirely deny that a younger version of himself, less certain of his own feelings, might have hesitated exactly as she feared. It was a bitter thing to recognize in oneself, even 3 years removed from the person he had been. In the morning, restless and unwilling to wait idly for evening and the promised meeting at the church, Alaric made his way into the town proper, intending only to walk and clear his thoughts. It was there, outside a modest building near the town square that bore a small brass plaque reading Bramwell and Sons, Solicitors, that he found himself stopping, struck by a sudden thought he could not quite explain. If the letter Rosalind described had truly come from men in London seeking to exploit her father's old debts, there would be some record of it. Debts of that nature did not simply vanish. They were bought and sold, transferred between creditors, tracked in ledgers somewhere. A local solicitor, particularly one who handled matters for families along this stretch of coast, might know something of how such threats were typically constructed, even if he knew nothing of Rosalind's case specifically. He stepped inside on impulse and found himself facing a thin, silver-haired man seated behind a cluttered desk, spectacles perched low on his nose, regarding the unexpected arrival of a duke into his modest office with an expression of polite, careful surprise. "Your Grace," the man said, rising quickly. "Silas Bramwell, at your service. I confess I did not expect such distinguished company this morning. How may I assist you?" Alaric explained, carefully and without naming her directly at first, that he sought information regarding a matter of old family debts, and the manner in which such debts might be used as leverage against a household some years after the original obligation had supposedly been settled. Bramwell listened with the attentive stillness of a man well practiced in discretion, occasionally jotting a note, until Alaric finished and the solicitor sat back in his chair, considering. "Debts of that nature are rarely so easily settled as families believe," Bramwell said finally. "It is not uncommon for a creditor to sell an outstanding obligation to a third party, particularly if the original debt seems unlikely to be repaid quickly. The purchaser, in turn, may hold the debt quietly for years, waiting for a moment when the family's circumstances have improved, or when some new vulnerability presents itself, before pressing the matter again. It is an ugly practice, Your Grace, but not an uncommon one, particularly among families connected to households of consequence." "And if the family in question had no knowledge the debt had been resold at all?" "Then they would have every reason to believe the matter closed," Bramwell said, "until the day a letter arrived informing them otherwise." Alaric felt something cold settle in his chest at the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. Is there a way to trace such a transaction? To learn who purchased a particular debt, and for what purpose? Bramwell studied him for a long moment, clearly aware now that this conversation concerned a matter far more personal than idle curiosity about legal practice. "It is possible, Your Grace, though it would require inquiries in London, among the record-keepers who track such transfers. May I ask whose debt we are discussing?" Alaric hesitated only briefly before answering. "The father of a woman named Rosalind Hartley. He died some years past, and she believed the debt settled through a modest inheritance." Something shifted in Bramwell's expression, a flicker of recognition that Alaric caught immediately. "Hartley," the solicitor repeated slowly. "I believe I may have some knowledge of that name, Your Grace, though I would need to consult my old correspondence to be certain. I handled a small matter years ago, before I relocated my practice to Devonshire, concerning a debt attached to a gentleman of that name. If my memory serves, the debt was purchased not by a stranger seeking profit, but by someone with a more particular interest in seeing it used." Alaric's pulse quickened. "Who?" Bramwell rose and moved to a cabinet in the corner of his office, drawing out a worn ledger and flipping through its pages with the careful patience of a man accustomed to searching through years of accumulated record. It took several long minutes, during which Alaric stood in near silence, before the solicitor found what he was searching for, and looked up, his expression grave. "The debt was purchased," Bramwell said slowly, "by a gentleman acting on behalf of your own late uncle, Your Grace, Lord Pelham." The name landed like a blow. Alaric's late uncle had died only a year past, but in life he had been a man of considerable influence and considerable bitterness, particularly toward the branch of the family that had inherited the dukedom instead of him, through an accident of birth order and circumstance he had never fully accepted. He had opposed nearly every decision Alaric made in the years before his death, and had made no secret, in certain circles, of his belief that the household was being poorly managed by a nephew he considered unfit for the title. Why would my uncle purchase a debt belonging to my companion's father? "I could not say with certainty," Bramwell admitted, "though I might venture a guess, if Your Grace will permit it. A companion with no fortune and no protection would make an easy target for pressure, particularly if that companion had become, in some way, important to the household's master. Threaten her, force her removal, and the household is disrupted without any direct confrontation ever taking place. It is a quiet, cowardly sort of interference, Your Grace, but not an uncommon one among families with old grievances and long memories." Alaric stood very still, the pieces of 3 years' confusion finally settling into a shape he could recognize. His uncle had known, somehow, of the growing attachment between himself and Rosalind, and rather than confront him directly, had chosen instead to strike at the one person in the household with no power to defend herself. It was, as Bramwell said, cowardly. It was also, Alaric realized with a slow, cold fury, entirely effective. Rosalind had vanished exactly as intended, and his uncle had never once needed to reveal his hand. "Is there proof of this?" Alaric asked. "Something beyond your recollection in this ledger?" "There would have been correspondence at the time," Bramwell said. I retained copies of certain letters, as is my practice, though I would need to search my older files to locate them. If your grace wishes, I would be glad to assist in gathering whatever proof remains. It seems to me that the lady in question deserves to know the truth of what drove her from her home, and that whoever orchestrated such a scheme ought to be answerable for it, whatever title or family connection they once held. Thank you, Mr. Bramwell. Alaric extended his hand, and the solicitor shook it firmly. I will return this evening, or tomorrow at the latest. Please, gather whatever you can find. He left the solicitor's office with his thoughts racing. The anger he felt toward his late uncle tangled uncomfortably with a fresh wave of guilt, directed entirely at himself. He had spent 3 years believing Rosalind's departure was simply a matter of her own choosing, a decision made and executed without any outside hand forcing it. He had never once considered that someone within his own family might have engineered her disappearance deliberately, using her father's old debts as a weapon precisely because she had no means to fight back. He thought of the evening in the church garden that awaited him, and understood now that he owed her more than an apology for his own slowness in finding her. He owed her the truth of what had truly driven her away, and an acknowledgement that the threat she had fled had never truly been about her own family's disgrace at all, but about protecting him from a danger he had never known existed within his own bloodline. The walk from the solicitor's office back toward the Harbor Inn felt longer than it had that morning, each step accompanied by the growing weight of what he now understood. Rosalind had not simply chosen silence over trust, as he had accused her the day before on the harbor wall. She had faced a threat orchestrated by a member of his own family, wielded with a precision that left her no safe way to fight back, and no one to turn to who might have believed her, given how carefully his uncle had always maintained his public reputation as a reasonable, if disapproving, relation. By the time evening arrived and Alaric made his way up the lane toward the small church at the edge of town, he had resolved that whatever conversation awaited him there, he would not repeat the mistake of the previous day. He would not press her for further explanation or measure her past choices against some standard of trust he had no right to demand. Instead, he would offer her the truth he had uncovered, and let her decide, this time with full knowledge of what had truly happened, what she wished to do next. He found her seated on a low stone bench beneath an old yew tree in the small churchyard, her shawl drawn close against the evening chill, watching the last light fade over the rooftops of the town below. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression, wary but not unwelcoming, told him she had spent the day turning over their conversation on the harbor wall just as thoroughly as he had. "You came," she said, echoing, without seeming to notice, the same words she had spoken to him at the start of their walk the day before. "I said I would." He sat beside her on the bench, leaving a careful distance between them, though not so much distance as the day before. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the churchyard broken only by the soft rustle of the yew's branches in the evening breeze. "I owe you an apology," Alaric said finally, "for yesterday. I came to this town believing your silence was the wound I needed explained, and in demanding that explanation, I gave little thought to what it might have cost you to give it. That was unfair of me." Rosalind turned to look at him, clearly surprised by the admission. "You are not entirely wrong in what you said. I did make the choice for both of us. Whatever my reasons, that much is true." "Perhaps," he said, "but I have learned something today that changes the shape of that choice considerably. I went to see a solicitor in town this morning, on little more than instinct, hoping to understand how a debt long believed settled might resurface as a threat years later. What I learned was not what I expected." He told her then, carefully and without softening any part of it, what Bramwell had uncovered. He watched her face as he spoke of his late uncle, watched the color drain slowly from her cheeks as the pieces of her own flight from London rearranged themselves into a shape she had never imagined. She had believed all this time that she alone had been the target, that some anonymous creditor had simply seen an opportunity for profit or scandal. She had never once considered that the threat had been engineered from within his own family, aimed not truly at her, but at him. "Lord Pelham," she whispered, when he had finished. "I met him only once, at a dinner not long before I left. He was polite enough, though there was something in his manner I did not care for. I never imagined he even knew my name, let alone that he would go to such lengths. He resented my inheriting the title over him," Alaric said grimly. "He made no secret of that resentment while he lived, though he was careful never to act against me in any way that could be traced back to him directly. This, it seems, was simply the version of that resentment he believed he could carry out without consequence. A quiet threat against a companion with no power to fight back, calculated to unsettle the household without ever revealing his hand." Rosalind sat very still, absorbing this, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Then it was never truly about my father's disgrace at all." No, Alaric said gently. It was about wounding me, through the person he believed I had grown to care for. He simply used your father's debts as the instrument, because it was the one weakness you had no means to defend. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky beyond the churchyard wall. I spent 3 years believing I had failed to protect my own family's name, she said finally, her voice unsteady, that the disgrace was mine to carry, mine to hide from. To learn now that it was never truly about that at all, that I was simply a piece moved in some quarrel between you and your uncle that I knew nothing of. She stopped, pressing her fingers briefly against her eyes. It is difficult to know what to feel. You have every right to feel angry, Alaric said. Angry at him, and perhaps rightly angry at me as well, for a family so tangled in its own old grievances that it could reach into your life and unravel it without you ever understanding why. I am not angry with you, she said quietly. I do not think I ever truly was. Not really. I was angry at the unfairness of it, at having no power to fight back, at watching my own life narrow to a single choice between silence and scandal. But that was never something you did to me, Alaric. It was something done to both of us, by a man neither of us could have anticipated. He reached, hesitantly, for her hand where it lay in her lap, and when she did not pull away, he closed his fingers gently around hers. There is proof to be gathered still, he said. Bramwell believes he retained correspondence from the time, and I intend to see it recovered, whatever it takes. Not merely to satisfy my own anger toward my uncle's memory, though I confess that anger runs deep tonight, but because I think you deserve to have the truth stand somewhere plainly, beyond the two of us sitting in this churchyard. You did nothing wrong, Rosalind. You were never a disgrace to be hidden. You were the target of a cruelty neither of us saw coming, and I intend to see that truth acknowledged, whatever it costs. Rosalind looked down at their joined hands, and for the first time since his arrival in Devonshire, something in her posture seemed to ease, as though a weight she had carried silently for 3 years had finally, if only slightly, begun to lift. Thank you, she said softly, for finding this, for not simply demanding I explain myself and leaving it there. I told you I would give you time, Alaric said. I meant it, but I could not simply wait idly while you decided whether to trust me again. Not when there was a truth to be found that might ease some part of what you have carried alone all this while. They sat together beneath the yew tree as the last light faded fully from the sky, and though neither of them spoke of what might come next, of London or titles or the uncertain shape their future might take, there was, for the first time, no urgency to fill the silence with words. It was enough for that quiet evening, simply to sit together in the churchyard, her hand resting in his, and let the truth they had uncovered settle slowly into something that felt, however cautiously, like the beginning of trust restored. The days that followed settled into a fragile, unfamiliar rhythm. Alaric remained in Devonshire, taking rooms at the Harbour Inn rather than returning to London, and each evening after the shop closed, he and Rosalind walked together, sometimes along the harbour, sometimes up the lane toward the churchyard, speaking of small things at first, the way one might test the strength of a bridge before trusting it fully with one's weight. Mrs. Bramwell's clerk had located the correspondence Silas Bramwell promised, a small bundle of letters tucked away in an old file box, and though the handwriting bore no direct signature, the seal pressed into the wax matched precisely the one Alaric recognized from his late uncle's private correspondence, kept still among the family's papers in London. It was not, perhaps, proof enough to satisfy a court of law, but it was proof enough for Alaric, and more than enough to finally silence any lingering doubt Rosalind might have carried about the true nature of what had driven her from London 3 years before. I still do not know what to do with the knowledge, Rosalind admitted one evening, as they walked along the harbour wall, the tide creeping slowly back in beneath a sky streaked orange with the last of the sunset. It changes nothing of the years I have already lived. I cannot return to the companion I once was, cannot undo the life I built here in the meantime. No one is asking you to undo anything, Alaric said. I only wanted you to know the truth. What you choose to do with it is entirely your own decision, as it should have been from the start. It was during this same week that Lady Beatrice Thorne arrived in Devonshire, unannounced and considerably displeased. Alaric's sister had grown accustomed, over the years, to her brother's occasional disappearances into private matters he preferred not to discuss, but a fortnight spent in a coastal town, with no word of his return, had finally exhausted her patience, and she had come herself to discover what business could possibly keep a duke so thoroughly occupied. She found him, on the afternoon of her arrival, seated outside a small tea shop near the harbour, deep in conversation with a woman Beatrice did not immediately recognize. though something in the woman's bearing, quiet and composed despite the plainness of her dress, struck her as oddly familiar. Alaric. Beatrice's voice cut across the tea shop's small courtyard with the particular sharpness she reserved for moments of genuine irritation. I have traveled 2 days to find you drinking tea in a fishing village, while half of London wonders whether you have abandoned your responsibilities entirely. Alaric rose at once, though his expression suggested he was more amused than alarmed by his sister's arrival. Beatrice, I did not expect you to come yourself. Clearly not, given that you left no word of where you had gone or why. Her sharp gaze shifted then to the woman still seated at the table, and something in her expression flickered, a slow dawning recognition that settled into open astonishment. Rosalind Hartley. Rosalind rose as well, her composure carefully maintained, despite the sudden tension that had entered the small courtyard. Lady Beatrice. You vanished 3 years ago without a single word, Beatrice said, her tone caught between accusation and disbelief. My brother searched the length of England for you, and now I find you here, sharing tea as though nothing at all occurred between you. Beatrice, Alaric said quietly, there is a great deal you do not yet understand. Then perhaps you might enlighten me, she said, before I decide whether to be furious with either of you, or simply relieved that my brother has finally stopped wandering about London like a man haunted by a ghost. They found a quieter table at the back of the courtyard, and Alaric explained, as plainly as he could, everything that had unfolded since his arrival in Devonshire, the letter Rosalind had received, the debts believed settled, and finally, the discovery of their late uncle's hand in the entire affair. Beatrice listened with growing horror, her earlier irritation dissolving into something far more somber as the full shape of the deception became clear. Uncle Pelham, she said finally, her voice hollow. I always knew he resented you for the title, Alaric, but I never imagined he would stoop to something so calculated, to threaten a woman with no power to defend herself, simply to wound you through her. She shook her head slowly, unable to finish the thought. She turned to Rosalind, and something in her sharp, guarded expression softened considerably. I owe you an apology, Miss Hartley. I confess I have thought unkindly of you these past 3 years, believing you had simply abandoned my brother without cause or care. I did not know the truth of what drove you away. You could not have known, Rosalind said. I told no one, not even the household staff who might have wondered at my sudden departure. I believed at the time that silence was the only way to protect everyone I cared for. And now? Beatrice asked, studying her with the same sharp attention she brought to every important question. What do you believe now? Rosalind glanced at Alaric before answering, and something passed between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Now I believe silence cost more than I ever intended it to. I am trying, slowly, to learn what honesty looks like instead. Beatrice's expression, for the first time since her arrival, eased into something almost like warmth. Well, she said, it seems my brother has finally found the one thing in 3 years capable of pulling him out of his own gloom. I suppose I ought to be grateful to whatever fortune brought you to this particular shop, in this particular town, at precisely the moment he happened to seek shelter from the rain. The conversation continued long into the afternoon, Beatrice's initial hostility giving way gradually to genuine curiosity about the life Rosalind had built for herself in Devonshire, the shop, Mrs. Cole, the quiet rhythms of a town far removed from the grandeur and scrutiny of London society. By the time the sun began to lower toward the horizon, something like the beginning of friendship had settled tentatively between the two women, born of shared concern for the same stubborn, quietly wounded man who sat between them. It was Lord Edmund Vane who disrupted the fragile peace that evening. He had watched with mounting frustration the growing closeness between Rosalind and the Duke over the preceding days, and the arrival of the Duke's sister, rather than easing his concerns, had only confirmed what he had feared since the harbor wall. Whatever chance he once believed he had with Rosalind Hartley was slipping steadily away, and he was not a man inclined to accept such losses quietly. He found the three of them still seated at the tea shop as evening approached, and approached the table with a stiff, deliberate formality that immediately drew Rosalind's wary attention. Miss Hartley, he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the notice of nearby tables. I had hoped, after our last conversation, that you might give proper consideration to my invitation. Instead, I find you once again in the company of a duke who, by his own admission, has no formal claim upon you beyond an acquaintance renewed after years of silence. Lord Vane, Rosalind said carefully, aware of the small crowd of curious onlookers her name and his tone had begun to attract. This is neither the time nor the place for such a conversation. Is there ever a proper time, Miss Hartley? You have declined my invitations for weeks now, always with some excuse. And now I understand at last that the excuse was never truly about your obligations at the shop. It was him. He gestured toward Alaric, his composure fraying visibly. A duke may offer you a great deal, I am certain, but I wonder if he has offered you honesty about what such an arrangement truly means for a woman of your station. A duke does not marry a shopkeeper's assistant, Miss Hartley, whatever pretty words he offers you beneath a churchyard tree. The words landed with cruel precision, and Rosalind felt her cheeks burn, though whether from embarrassment or anger, she could not immediately say. Beside her, Alaric rose slowly to his feet, his expression darkening with a controlled fury, far more unsettling than any shout might have been. Lord Vane, he said, his voice low and even, you will apologize to Miss Hartley for that remark, or you will leave this courtyard, and I would advise the latter only if you have no wish to discover precisely what a duke is capable of when someone he cares for is spoken to in such a manner. Lord Vane's bravado wavered visibly under the weight of Alaric's stare, though he did not immediately retreat. I only speak the truth others are too polite to voice, your grace. Then let me offer a truth of my own, Alaric said. Whatever arrangement exists between Miss Hartley and myself is none of your concern, and will remain so regardless of what title I hold, or what station she was born into. I would ask you to leave now, Lord Vane, before this conversation grows any less civil than it already has. For a long, tense moment, Lord Vane held his ground, his gaze flicking between Alaric's unyielding expression and Rosalind's carefully composed but visibly shaken face. Whatever calculation he made in that moment, it seemed at last to convince him the battle was already lost. He gave a stiff, shallow bow, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger, and turned without another word, disappearing into the gathering dusk of the harbor street. The small crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, and Beatrice let out a slow breath she had apparently been holding through the entire exchange. Well, she said, glancing between her brother and Rosalind with a wry, exhausted expression, it seems Devonshire is rather more eventful than I expected. Rosalind sat very still, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, the sting of Lord Vane's words lingering even after his departure. Alaric knelt beside her chair, his earlier fury softening into quiet concern. Are you well? He is not entirely wrong, she said quietly. About what a duke's title truly means, I have thought of it myself, more than once, these past weeks. Then let me be entirely clear, Alaric said, taking her hand firmly in his own, so that no doubt remains, from Lord Vane or anyone else in this town. I do not care what station you were born into, Rosalind. I care that you are the only person who has ever made me feel, in a house full of portraits and titles and old grievances, that I was simply a man, worth knowing for himself rather than for what he might offer. If that means defying every expectation society holds for a duke, then I will defy them gladly, and I will do so publicly, wherever and whenever you are ready to let me. Beatrice, watching the exchange with an expression that had softened entirely from her earlier irritation, reached across the table to touch Rosalind's other hand gently. For whatever it is worth, Miss Hartley, I would be glad to call you sister, if that is a title you find yourself willing to consider. My brother has been miserable company for 3 years. I would very much like my old, tolerable brother returned to me, and it seems you are the only one capable of managing that particular feat. Rosalind looked between them, the Duke kneeling beside her chair and his sister watching with unexpected warmth, and felt something in her chest, some final stubborn wall she had maintained for 3 long years, begin at last to give way. That night, after Beatrice had retired to the room she had taken at the inn and the harbor had gone quiet beneath a sky full of stars, Rosalind walked home alone, though Alaric had offered to accompany her. She had wanted, for a little while, simply to think, to let the events of the day settle into something she could hold steady in her mind, rather than the whirlwind they had felt in the moment. Mrs. Cole was waiting up for her, a single candle burning on the counter downstairs, and one look at Rosalind's face told her that the day had brought more than the ordinary business of the shop.
You look as though you have lived an entire year since this morning,
Mrs. Cole said, setting aside the mending in her lap. Rosalind sat heavily in the chair across from her, still turning over the events of the afternoon, the confrontation with Lord Vane, the fierce protectiveness in Alaric's voice, the unexpected kindness of a woman who had every reason to resent her, and instead had offered warmth. His sister came today, she said, Lady Beatrice. I feared she would despise me, given how I left things 3 years ago. But instead she offered me nothing but understanding, once she learned the truth. And Lord Vane? Rosalind's expression tightened slightly at the memory. He said cruel things, true things, in part, though cruelly spoken. He reminded me that a duke does not marry a shopkeeper's assistant, whatever fine words are exchanged beneath a churchyard tree. Mrs. Cole's expression hardened. That man has always had more confidence than sense. Titles matter a great deal less than he believes, Rosalind, when it comes to matters of the heart. I have lived long enough to see plenty of grand marriages built on nothing but convenient arrangement, and plenty of humble ones built on genuine devotion. I know which kind wears better over the years. Alaric said much the same, Rosalind admitted. He said he did not care what station I was born into, that he would defy every expectation society held for a duke, if that was what it took. And do you believe him? Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, staring at the candle flame flickering gently in the draught from the window. I want to, she said finally. I have spent 3 years convincing myself that wanting was not enough, that the safest course was always to expect the sensible outcome rather than the hoped-for one. But watching him today, standing between me and Lord Vane's cruelty without a moment's hesitation, I found myself wondering if perhaps I had been wrong to doubt him so completely, all this time. Then perhaps, Mrs. Cole said gently, echoing words she had offered once before, it is time to stop doubting, and simply see what comes of trusting instead. Rosalind managed a small, tired smile. You make it sound simple. It is rarely simple, Mrs. Cole said, rising to bank the fire for the night. But it is often, in my experience, worth the risk regardless. The following days passed more gently than the ones before. Lord Vane did not return to the shop, and word around the town suggested he had departed for London rather abruptly, his pride evidently too wounded to remain in a place where his defeat had been witnessed so publicly. Beatrice remained in Devonshire a while longer, and in that time, a genuine warmth grew between the two women, built on long walks through the town, and quiet evenings spent by the fire at Mrs. Cole's small kitchen table, where Beatrice, to everyone's surprise, proved rather skilled at mending, and even more skilled at teasing her brother mercilessly whenever he grew too solemn in Rosalind's presence. It was during one such evening, as the three of them sat together while rain tapped gently against the window panes, that Alaric finally raised the question that had clearly been resting, unspoken, at the back of his mind since his arrival in Devonshire. I have been thinking, he said, setting aside the cup of tea Mrs. Cole had pressed upon him, about what comes next. Not tonight, and not tomorrow, but eventually. I cannot ask you to answer such a question yet, Rosalind, not after everything that has passed between us these past weeks. But I wanted you to know that when the time comes, I intend to ask it properly, and publicly, so that no one, not Lord Vane, not the gossips of London, not even the memory of my late uncle's cruelty, might ever again cast doubt upon what you mean to me. Rosalind looked at him across the small table, the firelight catching the earnestness in his expression, and felt, for the first time in 3 long years, something that resembled not fear of what the future might hold, but a quiet, cautious hope. When the time comes, she said softly, I believe I will be ready to hear it. 3 weeks after Alaric first stepped dripping into the small shop near the church, an invitation arrived at Mrs. Cole's door, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Ashworth. Beatrice had returned briefly to London to attend to certain family matters, but she had left behind, at her brother's request, a task he considered of far greater importance than any business awaiting him at his estate. The invitation was for a gathering to be held at the assembly rooms in the nearest large town, the same rooms where Lord Vane had once hoped to escort Rosalind to a concert. It was addressed not merely to Mrs. Cole but to the whole of the small coastal community, an unusual gesture for a duke to extend toward fishermen's families and shopkeepers, and one that set the entire town buzzing with speculation for days before the appointed evening arrived. He has invited the whole town, Mrs. Cole said, reading the invitation aloud in disbelief. Rosalind, dukes do not typically host gatherings for shopkeepers and fishmongers. I do not know what he intends, Rosalind admitted, though a quiet unease had begun to settle in her chest, the sense that whatever Alaric planned, it was not simply a social evening. She was right to suspect as much. When the evening arrived and she entered the assembly rooms on Mrs. Cole's arm, she found the space transformed, candles lit along every wall, the local families she had come to know over 3 years mingling awkwardly but cheerfully alongside a handful of finely dressed guests who had clearly traveled some distance to attend, including, to Rosalind's considerable surprise, Beatrice, who greeted her with an embrace rather than the formal curtsy propriety might have demanded. He would not tell me exactly what he intended, Beatrice whispered as they embraced, only that I was to make certain you attended tonight, whatever excuse you tried to offer. Rosalind's unease deepened as she scanned the room, and found Alaric standing near the front, dressed with more formality than she had seen since his arrival in Devonshire, his expression composed but his eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded room. He crossed to her without hesitation, ignoring the murmurs that followed his path through the assembled guests, and took her hand gently in his own. "You look worried," he said quietly. "I am uncertain what I am meant to be prepared for," she admitted. "Only the truth," he said, spoken plainly, before everyone who matters. "Will you trust me a little longer tonight?" She nodded, though her heart was beating rather faster than the quiet music drifting through the room warranted. Alaric led her toward the front of the assembly, and as the murmur of conversation gradually quieted, sensing that something significant was about to unfold, he released her hand only long enough to face the gathered crowd. "I owe most of you an explanation," he began, his voice carrying easily through the now silent room. "3 weeks ago, I arrived in this town a stranger, searching for someone I had lost 3 years before, through circumstances I did not then fully understand. I have since learned the truth of what drove her away, and I find I can no longer remain silent about it, not when silence has already cost us so many years we might otherwise have spent together." He told the room without flinching, the story that had unfolded since his arrival, the letter Rosalind had received, the debts believed settled, and finally, the discovery of his late uncle's hand in orchestrating the entire cruel scheme. A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered guests, particularly among the small cluster of London acquaintances who had traveled with Beatrice, clearly unaware until this moment of the scandal that had quietly shaped a duke's household for the past 3 years. "I say this not to shame my late uncle's memory before those who once respected him," Alaric continued, "though I confess I feel little inclination to protect a reputation built on such cruelty. I say it because Rosalind Hartley has spent 3 years believing herself the source of a disgrace that was never truly hers to carry. She left everything she knew, everyone she cared for, to protect people who never once knew the sacrifice she made on their behalf. I will not allow that sacrifice to remain hidden any longer, nor will I allow anyone in this room, or in London, to whisper of her past, as though it were some shameful secret, rather than an act of extraordinary selflessness." Rosalind stood beside him, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, though something in Alaric's steady presence beside her kept the trembling from overwhelming her entirely. She had not expected this, had not imagined he intended to lay their entire history bare before a room full of strangers and neighbors alike, and yet as she looked out at the faces watching her, she found not judgment, but something closer to sympathy, even admiration, particularly among the townsfolk who had known her only as the quiet, hard-working assistant at Mrs. Cole's shop. "There is more," Alaric said, and Rosalind felt her breath catch as he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his own. "Rosalind, I did not come to Devonshire merely to find answers, or to clear the shadow my family cast over your name. I came because some part of me has never stopped believing that the life I want, the life I have imagined every night for 3 long years, is impossible without you standing beside me in it. I do not ask you to forget the years we lost, nor to pretend the pain of them did not happen. I ask only that you allow me to spend whatever years remain proving that I understand, now, what it means to choose you plainly, publicly, without hesitation or calculation, whatever the cost to name or reputation." He knelt then, before the entire gathered assembly, and Rosalind heard, distantly, a collective intake of breath from the crowd around them. Beatrice's soft, delighted laugh somewhere near the front, Mrs. Cole's hand pressing briefly against her own heart in surprise and joy. "Rosalind Hartley," Alaric said, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because it is sensible, or expected, or likely to please anyone beyond the 2 of us standing here tonight, but because I love you, and have loved you, I think, since the first evening you asked me my opinion of a book's ending in a library neither of us truly had any business haunting so late into the night." Tears gathered in Rosalind's eyes, though she found herself laughing softly through them, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise the room. 3 years of careful silence, of guarded solitude, of believing herself unworthy of exactly this moment, dissolved beneath the weight of his steady, earnest gaze, and she found that her answer required no deliberation at all. "Yes," she said, and then louder, so that the whole room might hear it clearly. "Yes, Alaric, I will." The assembly rooms erupted into applause and cheerful noise, the townsfolk who had known her only as a quiet shopgirl, now witnessing, with evident delight, the unexpected transformation of their neighbor's life unfolding before them. Alaric rose and pulled her into an embrace that lingered far longer than propriety typically allowed, though no one in the room seemed inclined to mind the impropriety in the slightest. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Rosalind found a quiet moment near one of the tall windows overlooking the harbor. The same harbor where she had once walked with careful, guarded distance beside a man she had believed she must refuse. Alaric found her there, and together they looked out at the dark water, the lights of fishing boats bobbing gently in the distance. "I never imagined," she said softly, "that I would stand in this room again and feel nothing but happiness at the sight of it." "Lord Vane's concert invitation," Alaric said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I confess I have not entirely forgiven that room for the discomfort it once caused. It has been thoroughly redeemed tonight," she said, laughing. He wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together, watching the harbor, saying nothing at all, because for the first time in 3 years, there was nothing left unspoken between them that truly needed saying. Mrs. Cole approached them eventually, her eyes suspiciously bright, and took Rosalind's hands in her own weathered ones. "I always suspected there was a story behind that quiet composure of yours," she said. "I am only glad I lived to see it end so well." "It is not an ending," Rosalind said, glancing at Alaric with a warmth that had, until that evening, remained carefully hidden even from herself. "I think it is only just beginning." Beatrice joined them soon after, raising a glass and a toast that drew the attention of the remaining guests still lingering near the windows. "To honesty," she said, "however long it takes to arrive, and to the particular stubbornness of my brother, who apparently required an entire rainstorm and 3 years of misery before he found the sense to walk into the right shop at the right moment." Laughter rippled through the small gathering, and Rosalind found herself laughing along with them, the weight of 3 years of silence finally, fully lifted from her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, the news of the engagement traveled quickly, first through the small coastal town, where the fishermen's wives who had once known her only as the quiet assistant at Mrs. Cole's shop now greeted her with warm smiles and eager questions, and then, inevitably, to London, where it arrived among the season's gossip with considerably more force than either Rosalind or Alaric had anticipated. Not everyone received the news with the same warmth as the townsfolk of Devonshire. There were whispers among certain circles of society, murmurs about a duke marrying so far beneath his station, questions raised about the wisdom of attaching oneself to a woman whose own father had died leaving disgraceful debts behind him. Alaric answered each such whisper with the same steady, unhesitating conviction he had shown that evening in the assembly rooms, refusing every opportunity to distance himself from the truth of Rosalind's past. And in time, faced with his unwavering resolve, even the sharpest tongues in London found the subject grew tiresome to pursue. Silas Bramwell, true to his word, continued gathering the remaining correspondence that confirmed Lord Pelham's role in orchestrating the scheme against Rosalind's family, and though Alaric ultimately decided against pursuing any public accusation against his late uncle's memory, believing the matter better left quietly closed than dragged into further scandal, he made certain that anyone who mattered, family solicitors, trusted household staff, close family friends, understood plainly the truth of what had happened and why. It was not vindication shouted from every rooftop, but it was enough, Rosalind found, to finally release the last lingering doubt she carried about her own worth in the households and drawing rooms she would soon be expected to enter as a duchess. Mrs. Cole, for her part, refused every offer Alaric extended to compensate her for the loss of her most reliable shop assistant, though she accepted, with considerably more grace, his suggestion that the small shop might benefit from certain repairs to its roof and shop front, repairs that had been needed for years but never quite affordable on the modest earnings the business generated. When Rosalind protested that she did not wish her happiness to come at the expense of charity extended too obviously, Mrs. Cole simply waved the concern away with her usual brisk practicality. "You spent 3 years keeping this shop running smoothly through storms and slow seasons alike," she said. "If your duke wishes to mend a roof in gratitude for that labor, I see no reason either of us should refuse him the pleasure." The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a bright morning in early autumn, was held not in the grand cathedral in London that tradition might have dictated, but in the small church at the edge of the Devonshire town, beneath the same yew tree where Alaric had first offered Rosalind the truth of what his family had done. It was a decision Rosalind had made deliberately, wanting the place that had witnessed her honesty to also witness her joy, and Alaric had agreed without a moment's hesitation, understanding instinctively why the choice mattered so deeply to her. The small church could not comfortably hold every guest who wished to attend, and so the ceremony spilled out into the churchyard itself. Townsfolk and London guests alike gathered together beneath the autumn sky, an unusual mingling of station and circumstance that would have scandalized polite society only a generation before, but which felt, on that particular morning, entirely and simply right. Beatrice stood beside Rosalind throughout the ceremony, having appointed herself, with characteristic determination, as both sister and closest confidant in the weeks of preparation leading up to the wedding. Mrs. Cole sat in the front row, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a handkerchief she insisted was merely required by the autumn chill, rather than any sentiment she cared to admit to openly. And Silas Bramwell, invited at Alaric's insistence and recognition of the truth he had helped uncover, watched from a modest seat near the back, quietly satisfied with the small, meaningful part he had played in bringing the couple to this moment. When the ceremony concluded and Alaric and Rosalind emerged from the church as husband and wife, the gathered crowd erupted into applause that carried easily across the churchyard and down toward the harbor below, where fishing boats bobbed gently in the autumn light, indifferent to the celebration but somehow fitting company for it all the same. Rosalind looked out at the familiar rooftops of the town that had sheltered her for 3 quiet years, at the shop where she had rebuilt a life from nothing, at the harbor path where honesty had first begun to replace fear, and felt, for the first time since the morning she had fled London before dawn, that every part of her history, painful and joyful alike, had finally settled into a story she was proud to claim entirely as her own. "No regrets?" Alaric asked quietly, as they walked together down the churchyard path toward the small gathering awaiting them. "None," Rosalind said, and meant it fully. "Only gratitude that a duke once wandered into the wrong shop on a rainy afternoon, and refused to leave until he found his way back to where he belonged." He laughed then, the sound warm and unguarded, and drew her hand through his arm as they walked together toward their waiting future, the harbor lights already beginning to glow faintly in the gathering dusk behind them, steady and constant, much like the love that had finally, after 3 long years, found its way home. They did not leave for London that same evening, though a grand household and a full calendar of society obligations awaited them there soon enough. Instead, Alaric had arranged for them to spend one final night at the Harbor Inn, in the same small room where he had once lain awake turning over Rosalind's every word, wondering whether the woman he loved would ever agree to see him again. They stood together at the window that night, looking out over the water exactly as he once had alone, though now her hand rested easily in his, and the fear that had once kept them apart had dissolved entirely into something quieter and far more lasting. Below them, the town slept peacefully, unaware and unconcerned that within its modest streets and shop fronts, an old cruelty had finally been answered with an honesty stronger than any scheme designed to smother it. "Do you ever wonder," Rosalind asked softly, "what might have happened if it had not rained that afternoon? If you had simply passed through Devonshire without ever stepping into the shop at all?" Alaric considered the question seriously, his arm tightening gently around her shoulders. "I do not think it would have mattered," he said finally. "I believe I would have found you eventually, rain or no rain, shop or no shop. Some things, I have come to understand, insist on finding their way home, however long the road, however many wrong turns are taken along the way." Rosalind rested her head against his shoulder, watching the harbor lights flicker steadily against the darkness, and allowed herself, at last, fully and without reservation, to believe him. A year passed, and the grand house in London that had once felt to Rosalind like a place of borrowed belonging had become, slowly and unmistakably, her own home. She still remembered, with a private smile, her first weeks there as a new duchess, the careful way the household staff had watched her, uncertain how to treat a mistress who had once occupied a position not far above their own. That uncertainty had faded quickly, replaced by a genuine warmth she had never expected to find so easily, born largely from her insistence on remembering every name, every small kindness, every birthday and family illness among the staff who kept the household running. She had changed the library first, of all the rooms in the house. It had remained largely untouched since the days when she and Alaric had spent quiet evenings there as companion and duke, careful never to acknowledge aloud what was growing between them. Now she filled its shelves further, adding volumes of her own choosing, and it became, as it once had been in secret, the room where they most often retreated together at the close of a long day. The estrangement between the wider family and the memory of Lord Pelham had never been fully resolved, nor did Alaric feel any particular urgency to resolve it. He had chosen, in the end, to let his uncle's cruelty remain a quiet, private truth rather than a public scandal, believing that Rosalind's happiness mattered far more than any satisfaction he might have found in exposing the dead man's schemes before all of society. It was a decision Rosalind had come, over the following months, to respect deeply, understanding that some forms of justice mattered less than simply choosing, each day, not to let old cruelty define the shape of a new life. Mrs. Cole visited twice that year, each time arriving with the same brisk practicality that had once steadied Rosalind through her earliest days in Devonshire, and each time departing with gifts for the shop that Rosalind insisted on sending, despite the older woman's persistent protests that she required no charity from a duchess. The shop itself had flourished under new repairs and a growing reputation, helped no doubt by the quiet fact that its former assistant had gone on to marry a duke, a detail that drew curious customers from towns further along the coast, eager to see the humble counter where such an unlikely romance had once begun. Lord Edmund Vane, Rosalind learned through occasional London gossip, had married within the year. A young heiress with a considerable fortune and, by most accounts, considerably less patience for his particular brand of wounded pride than Rosalind herself had shown. She felt, hearing the news, no lingering resentment toward him, only a distant, faintly amused relief that his wounded ego had found somewhere else to settle. Beatrice remained a constant presence in their lives, her sharp wit softened only slightly by evident happiness at her brother's transformed disposition. She had taken to visiting nearly every week, often arriving unannounced with some new piece of London gossip or a fresh complaint about a suitor she had, in typical fashion, already dismissed before he had properly finished courting her. Rosalind had come to treasure these visits deeply, grateful for the sister she had never expected to find in a woman who might so easily have remained a stranger, or worse, an enemy. It was on a quiet evening in early spring, nearly a year to the day since Alaric had first stepped dripping into Mrs. Cole's shop, that Rosalind found him standing at the library window, watching the last light fade over the London rooftops, an expression on his face she recognized instantly as the same quiet, searching look he had worn that very first afternoon in Devonshire. "You are thinking of the shop again," she said, joining him at the window. "I am thinking of how close I came to never finding it at all," he admitted. "If the rain had not driven me indoors that particular afternoon, if I had chosen any other shop along that street to shelter in, I wonder how many more years might have passed before I found you. You told me once you believed you would have found me regardless," Rosalind reminded him gently. "Some things insist on finding their way home. I believe that more firmly now than I did that night," he said, turning to face her fully, his hand finding hers with the same easy familiarity it always did now, so different from the careful, uncertain distance they had once maintained between them. "I have been thinking, lately, of returning to Devonshire this summer, not merely to visit Mrs. Cole, though I know you would welcome the chance to see her again, but because I find myself wanting to walk that harbor wall once more, not as a man desperately searching for what he lost, but as a man simply grateful for what he found." Rosalind smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as the last light faded fully from the sky beyond the window. "I would like that very much," she said, "though I suspect Mrs. Cole will insist on putting us both to work behind the counter for at least an afternoon, duke or no duke." "I would not have it any other way," Alaric said, and meant it entirely. They stood together at the window a while longer, the London evening settling quietly around them, the life they had built together since that rainy afternoon in Devonshire stretching comfortably ahead, no longer shadowed by old debts or inherited cruelty, but bright instead with the particular hard-won peace that comes only to those who have survived silence and found, on the other side of it, the courage to finally speak the truth aloud. In the months that followed, their summer visit to Devonshire became something of a yearly tradition, one they maintained faithfully even as their household grew and their responsibilities in London multiplied. Each year they walked the same harbor wall, sat beneath the same yew tree in the churchyard, and spent at least one afternoon behind the counter of Mrs. Cole's shop, much to the delight of the townsfolk who had watched their unlikely romance unfold from its very first rainy beginning. The first of these summer visits brought an unexpected surprise. Mrs. Cole, now well into her later years and slower on her feet than she once had been, greeted them at the shop door with an announcement she had clearly been saving for their arrival. She had decided, she told them, to pass the running of the shop to a young woman from a neighboring village, a quiet, capable girl named Margaret who reminded Rosalind, in certain small ways, of herself, when she had first arrived in Devonshire 3 years before her own life had changed so entirely. "I am not leaving the shop altogether," Mrs. Cole assured them, settling into the chair by the window she had once occupied every working day of her life. "I intend to remain close enough to offer my opinions whenever they are needed, whether Margaret wants them or not. But my knees have grown tired of standing behind that counter, and I find I would rather spend my remaining years watching the harbor from this chair than measuring ribbon for every passing customer." Rosalind spent that particular afternoon seated beside her old friend and employer, listening to stories of the shop's history she had never before had the patience or occasion to ask about, while Alaric, true to his word, took his turn behind the counter, much to the amusement of the local customers who found it endlessly entertaining to be served by a duke fumbling good-naturedly with bolts of cloth and spools of thread. It was during that same visit that Beatrice arrived unannounced, as was her habit, accompanied this time by a quiet, thoughtful gentleman she introduced simply as a friend from London, though the careful way her hand rested near his arm suggested the friendship ran considerably deeper than she was yet willing to admit aloud. Rosalind said nothing of her suspicions, choosing instead to welcome the stranger warmly, and trust that Beatrice, in her own time and her own stubborn fashion, would share whatever news she was not yet ready to speak plainly. Silas Bramwell, too, remained a quiet fixture in their lives, called upon occasionally for matters of family business, though the friendship that had grown between him and Alaric extended well beyond formal obligation. He visited the harbor town himself that summer, drawn as much by genuine fondness for the coastal air as by any remaining legal matters, and spent a pleasant evening at Mrs. Cole's table recounting, for Beatrice's evident delight, the exact moment he had first recognized the name Hartley in his old ledger, and understood the small, quiet role he was about to play in mending a story that had nearly ended in permanent silence. As the years passed, Rosalind and Alaric's household in London grew to include 2 children, a daughter with her mother's quiet composure, and a son who inherited, much to Beatrice's endless amusement, his father's tendency toward stubborn, single-minded devotion once he had settled his affections on something, or someone, he considered worth the effort. Rosalind told them both, as soon as they were old enough to understand, the story of the shop and the rainy afternoon that had changed everything, though she was careful, in the telling, to emphasize not the years of painful silence that had preceded it, but the courage it had eventually taken to choose honesty over fear. Your father, she would tell them, settling them each evening into the same library that had once witnessed the quiet beginnings of her own love story, walked into the wrong shop on a rainy day, and refused to leave until he found his way back to where he truly belonged. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with nothing more than a little rain and a great deal of stubbornness. Rosalind never forgot the years of silence that had once nearly cost her everything, nor did she pretend the scars of that time had vanished entirely. But she had learned, in the years since, that the truest measure of love was not the absence of hardship, but the willingness to stand together through it, honestly and without hesitation, however long the road home might prove to be. And whenever doubt crept quietly back into her thoughts, as it occasionally still did, she needed only to look toward the man beside her, steady and unwavering since the very first rainy afternoon he had refused to leave without her, to remember exactly why she had, at last, allowed herself to be found.